Well, I'm so glad to be here to talk to you tonight about folk art. Florida. We all know that Florida is a state unlike any other state. Dave Barry, who most of you probably know as a writer, a satirist, says that Florida has a never-ending source of materials to write about. You can't stop. And that's the way it was when I first started doing research on folk artists. I couldn't stop. There were so many artists to talk about, doing fabulously different things. So Dave Barry says that it's a statistical fact that Florida has only 6% of the nation's population. It's probably a lot more now since he said that, but it produces 57% of the nation's weirdness. Now, I don't mean that to disparage any of the artists that I'm going to talk to you about, but I will tell you that they create from a very different kind of grounding than artists from other states, and also from artists that you might call fine artists. They see things differently. And because Florida is a state that is welcoming to people for second chances, it's welcoming to people who see things differently, you may see things like this on the roadside, advertising who we are and how people create. We can see that there's a lot of excess here. In other words, artists often use the materials that are around them, and they oftentimes collect lots of things to help inspire them in order to create. There's always that can-do. I'll make a sign, I'll set up a business, and many of these artists have just kind of figured out things as they go along. Our signage from these handmade signs are really, really terrific, and now people are collecting them. I want to start with the first artist as Taft Richardson. He has passed away a couple years ago. Perhaps one of the more interesting artists I've ever met in my entire life, from Tampa. And he made all of these creatures, these sculptures, out of bones. Where did he get his bones? From roadkill. Unbelievable. Seeing things that other people wouldn't see. And so people would find the roadkill, take it to his house. He would put it then in his backyard and let the birds and the bugs and the animals eat at it. And then he would take the pieces of bone and he would put it in his pocket. And he would hold it in his pocket until he was told by the bones where they needed to go in a new sculpture. The whole things are made by bones. Even the glue on these pieces is made from crushed up bones. So here's a house. Now, if you look at this, a horse, excuse me. If you look at this really, really carefully, you can see the number of bones that were put into this. This one piece is in the Manila Museum of Art. And Frank Holt, who was the curator of that museum for a long time, said that if there was ever a fire at the Manila, the first thing he would do would be to take that horse out of there, save it. Now, Taft Richardson didn't like or want to sell his art. And this was a man who lived extremely simply. I mean, he could have used the money, and this work could have provided him with a decent amount of money. But he said that all his pieces needed to be kept together. The other thing that he said about his work was that it was the resurrection. So if you think about all those animals that were killed, he has taken their bones and resurrected them, recreated them, remade them into something else. And he likens this in his community to the fact that somebody could do something wrong. They could commit a crime. They could do a meanness to another person. But they could be forgiven their lives can be resurrected, things can change. And so he was a preacher. And that was the message that he wanted to tell everyone in his neighborhood. He brought the children around. The children came. They called him Pied Piper. And he taught them how to play the drums. He did a lot of gardening in the rented house that he had. He called it the Garden of Eden. So he's creating all the time about all kinds of things. Go back and see this one. You see his long beard? He loved the children in the neighborhood so much that we cut little pieces of their hair off of their head and weave it into his beard. So he said that he could keep the children in the community close to him. So he was an exceptional man. He got sick. Those of us who loved him very dearly wanted to take him to the hospital. He had prostate cancer, which is what killed him. But he felt that Jesus died for us and suffered, and he felt that it was all right for him to do that as well. And when he was ready to go, he was ready to go because he believed in the resurrection. Okay, so all kinds of different things that he made. The work that he did is still in that African American community in Tampa. And there are actually people who were building a community center around it. He wanted it to remain there and not to be sold. Here's the kids with their artwork. Okay, this is Earl Cunningham, and some of you may have seen his work at the Manello. Have many of you gone to the Manello to see his work? In Orlando. So the Manello Museum was founded based on Earl Cunningham's work. So he was from St. Augustine. He lived on St. George Street in the traditional older part of town. And he had a gallery which was called Overfork. But Earl Cunningham was kind of a curmudgeon. And he named his gallery Overfork because he really wanted people to come in and fork over their money. So he sold junk. And when there wasn't anybody in his store, he went to the back of his store and painted. Now the paintings weren't for sale, but they were all about his earlier life, traveling in boats from Boothbay, Maine, down to Florida. So you can see that he'll put he'll create the boats, he'll create some Seminole landscape, and a lot of Florida landscape, all kind of put together. It's another one. So there was a woman named Marilyn Manello who went by his Overfork gallery at one time and saw a painting in the window which he said, "It's not for sale." And he said, "But you can come in the back and see the other paintings." And so they went back there, and she just really wanted to have one of his paintings. And he said, she said to him, "Name your price." And he named an exorbitant price, and she said, "Okay, I'm going to an ATM, and I'll come back and I'll buy it." And then it grew. Earl Cunningham, the collection kind of grew, and when he died, he committed suicide. All of the works that they could find everywhere went into the collection at the Manello Museum. Lil and Wally Broder. So, you know, we have lots of people, maybe some of you who've come down here to live from the north in your retirement years. Well, Lily and Wally Broder also did that. They came from Massachusetts and lived in the Panhandle. And before they left, they had seen in a magazine that there were these things called Sailor's Valentines. This is what one looks like. And so there were a group of people who were making these Sailor's Valentines. They used to come from Barbados or somewhere in the islands. Some people say that the sailors made them. Other people said, no, the sailors just bought them from the natives on the islands and would bring them back and give them to their mother or their sweetheart. So they're all made out of seashells. So they came down to Florida to retire and to make these sailors' valentines. So Wally would do the woodwork and the structure for it, and Lil would do the inside work. Now, when I was doing the research on the folk art for the state, I tried to see them for months, maybe close to a year. And they told me they were too busy to see me because they had a really strict schedule on making their sailors' valentines. So they would get up in the morning. They'd each go to their separate studios, which were out in the back. Hers was clean. His was a woodworking studio, which was dirty. And then they would come in, have lunch, and then they would go back and work some more, and then they would play cribbage at night. Didn't really have time for visitors. They finally saw me. I asked if I could buy one. They said no. They weren't for sale. And then when Lil and Wally Broder went to a nursing home, they called me and said, okay, you could buy one, which I did. Sylvia Thompson. Now, Lil and Wally Broder, they ordered their seashells. They came to Florida and yet used seashells that they ordered, mail ordered. Sylvia Thompson from Longboat Key, she belongs to a group that actually picks up the seashells. And she says if you're going to make things out of the seashells, you should never order them. She also doesn't sell her pieces. She gives them away. She's very wealthy. She gives them away to charities. Oops, I'm just pushing this too fast. So you can see all around her house are these flower arrangements that are made out of seashells. And they all look different. They're just everywhere in this huge, huge house. And they're really quite stunning. She even has seashells in drawers everywhere. Her garage, she couldn't put the cars in the garage because she had seashells all over there just soaking. And here she would get up and, she lives on Longboat Key, and that's one of the best places for shelling in the world. She used to wear, she knows when the tides come in and everything, and she had one of those miner's hats that has the light on it, so if she had to go out during the evening or in the early morning when it was dark, she knew how to find those seashells. Purvis Young, perhaps one of the best known artists, folk artists from Florida. He has passed away from diabetes. He is a man who lived in Overtown, which was part of Miami, an African-American part of Miami, that had done pretty well for a lot of years, but then went into disarray with AIDS and the drug epidemic. So he had a studio, no heat or cooling, and he made hundreds of paintings, like this one. Now, one of the things that's really wonderful about his work is that he has his own way of seeing the world. And he really wanted to paint for the people in his African-American community. So these horses are tributes to the Native American, because the Native American got to see the world by riding horses. Some of his other paintings have Mack trucks in them, so he's fascinated by Mack trucks. But that's the way African American men get to see the world. They drive a Mack truck. Now, Purvis Young was arrested when he was young for robbery and spent some time in prison. He then decided that he was going to be an artist. This is a man with very little formal education, and I'll tell you that when I interviewed him, and I interviewed him a couple times, he could talk about almost any artist as easily as I could, having studied academically for many, many years. He knew what he was doing. The people in the Miami Library knew him. They knew when he was coming, and he would just spend hours upon hours going through all the art books. Another interesting thing about his work is that you can see the frame that goes around his paintings. They're different pieces of board that he creates the frame from. Now this is something that comes from an African aesthetic, and in the 80s and 90s when we were trying to diversify the art world, people started paying attention to the aesthetics that come from Africa and that are still situated in many African American artists' being. This is how they see the world. Well, he knew, this is an African belief, that evil spirits land on straight lines. So you don't want a frame that is a straight line. So you will see all of his frames that are taken apart piece by piece, and sometimes in very different kinds of ways. Like you can see the frame in the person up in the head. So he breaks all these rules. The head, these big heads that he has in his paintings, they are the angels in the sky that look after the African American community. So they're everywhere. It's very important for him to create that kind of blessing or help for his community people. You should also know that, and we were talking about Taft Richardson, this idea that you use what you can find in your own community. He uses tossed out wood from his neighborhood. So he'll spend time going on his bicycle, looking for debris that he can bring back to his studio and paint on. He'll paint on anything. He'd actually also take books, old books that were tossed out, and especially history books, and he would paint the African American man in those books as if he was rewriting history. The African American story, he said, had not been told, and it had not been told properly. You see another one? All these squiggly little figures, these are the African Americans rising up in their community. And this is a funeral. He is one of our Florida Folk Heritage Awarded artists. He is also in the Florida Artist Hall of Fame. But you can see his work all over the country. His work is in the Metropolitan, it's in all of our major museums. Mary Proctor, she's from Tallahassee. She has a very unusual story, and I'll tell it to you the way she told it to me. I had a friend who worked at the state government in Tallahassee, and she called me and she said, "You need to come up and meet Mary Proctor, and you need to do it really quickly." And so I got on the road and came up to meet Mary. She was in her early 30s when I met her. She had been running a flea market right outside of Tallahassee, and so she had all kinds of materials with which to create, but she wasn't really creating. And then there was a fire that killed her it killed her grandmother and her grandfather and I think an uncle. And so she went into terrible depression. She sat under an old oak tree, she said, and she prayed to God for 30 days. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And on the 30th day, God said to her, "Paint 1,000 doors." Now, obviously, a door could have allowed her relatives to get out of the burning building. And so she started doing that. You could see she then went over to work on windows. But these are the kinds of doors that she wrote. It was all about tributes to her grandmother. So her mother had her when, she told me, when her mother was 11 or 12, and had not told her mother's mother, her grandmother, that she was pregnant. And because she was a little hefty, her grandmother didn't even know. And then she had the baby, and she left it in a ditch to die. The grandmother found the baby, Mary, and raised her. So she loved her grandmother very, very much. And so these are all tributes to her, on doors, on windows, on all kinds of things that she could find. And people started bringing her doors when they found that. So they would just leave the doors outside of her flea market, and she would pick them up and start working on them. These works of hers, Mary Proctor's works, if you ever go to a House of Blues, her works are everywhere there. So you can see what happened. Mary is very energetic. So she started collaging cars. She started collaging huge doors, garage doors. There's nothing that she just wouldn't put some kind of artwork on. She's also a healer. You can see here, it's really like an environment now. I understand that she's no longer working in this space now. She's now working in an old, mostly abandoned strip mall. But she is a healer. In many African American folklore, if you're born with a caul over your face, like a veil over your face, that means that you have special powers. And Mary was born with a caul over her face, and so she can heal people. So I had a really good friend, her name was Anita Wooten, who lived down the street from me, who was an artist, and she had cancer, and she wanted just to be able to live long enough to see her daughter graduate from high school. But she went to Boston for all kinds of treatment, but she would stop oftentimes at Mary's place and ask for a blessing. And Mary would heal her, and Anita lived actually to see her daughter graduate from college. She said Mary was good. Cardale Evans, he's an Orlando artist who lives just right around the Citrus Bowl. And he says, you know, his father was a contractor, so he built many of the homes in this particular neighborhood. But Cardale said that once he was named Cardale, he thought that he was supposed to be working with cars. So that's what he did. He ran a body shop. And when the cars couldn't be fixed any longer, he would take the hoods of the car and he would put them in the middle of the street, and all the neighbors would come around and he would jump up and down on them until he would make these African-looking masks. And then he would tell somebody in the neighborhood, this one's you. This is a portrait of you. Again, he didn't like to sell his work. He just did it for fun. But he would hang them up on his fence in front of his body shop. He also did some welding, so I was able to buy a few of his small pieces from him, which he let me have. So he would do a number of creatures that were, you know, quite whimsical and fun. Very creative guy. We tried to have shows for him to sort of give him some visibility, and he really never did. He didn't want it. It just wasn't his thing to enter into the art world. So you can see how so many of these artists function in a particular community, in a particular way that brings people together. Melvin Thayer, Highway 17, Seville is where he lived. And this is a man from Appalachia who also worked with junk. And he thought that you really didn't have to have any money. You could make almost anything that you wanted out of junk. So he would go down to a junkyard and bring home all kinds of junk. He also was not a people person. I would stand outside his barbed wire fence time and time again and say, please let me in, I want to talk to you. And he would ignore me. And finally, when he knew I wasn't going to go away, one day he said, okay, you can come in, but I'm busy. And so I learned a lot about him. Here he is making one of his pieces. He likes transportation, and he started doing this for one of his children, his grandchildren. And he just makes everything from junk. that he picks up. Now he says sometimes when he sorts through the junk and he needs something that he can't make, he will go sell scrap metal. And from there, he will have food or something else that he might need to live. His wife would sit there in front of the house with the chickens running around and drink a beer. Here's one of his. They're called whirligigs because his pieces move with the wind. And he wanted people to be able to see them because he put them in the front yard. But he didn't want people to bother him while he was working. So this is the front of his house, and you can see that he's trying to show people all of his creativity, but he also doesn't want you to be bothered with people. We had, I asked him if we could borrow some of his pieces one time, and that we would have an exhibition of them in Orlando, and he said, well, yeah, I guess I could lend them to you. So I brought the curator over, and we talked to him about a loan agreement where we would pay him some money in order to borrow his pieces, which we would then give back. And he said, no, I don't need any money. There's no reason to have money from this. So, he prided himself on being self-sufficient. Kurt Zimmerman lives in Cocoa Beach. He's in his 90s, probably late 90s by now. Kurt Zimmerman is also an extremely interesting person in terms of the way that he sees the world. He worked at NASA as an engineer, but he was a immigrant from Germany. He came here when he was a very young boy, and then when World War II broke out, he had to go bomb his home country. That sent him into terrible depression. He was put in a mental hospital for a while, taken all kinds of drugs. He lost his first wife. And he said it didn't work. All of those drugs didn't work. But when he found painting, when he found art, he learned to heal himself. So this is one of his I think this is flying hamster. But anyway, like Taft Richardson, he was also very aware of what happened to roadkill. Animals that get killed on the road. And he figured that if a car came along and smashed an animal and killed it, that was the same thing as people in a village being hit by a bomb and dying. So what he figured he could do is bring them back to life by painting them. This is one of the parallel universes. This is what a parallel universe in his mind looks like, where all these different animals will go. Oops, and another one. Really, really beautiful. He's working three-dimensionally now, and I haven't been to visit him since he's been doing all this new work, but I have tried. Ruby Williams from Bealsville. She calls it Beesville, but it's Balsville. That's right outside of Plant City. And I've known Ruby for probably 25 years. One of my students met her and said, you've got to come down to Bealsville and meet Ruby. Well, Ruby had been in New Jersey, where she had been accused of stealing something. And she was so upset that anyone would think that she would ever steal anything that she came home to the land where her mother and her grandmother had lived, a couple acres across the Highway 60. And she started planting fruit and vegetables and opened a produce stand. And then and then she made signs for the produce stand, which went up and down the highway and led into her produce stand. And people would come by and say, I'll have the black-eyed peas, I'll have the strawberries, and I'll have that sign. And she thought, wow. So she would take her hammer, take the nail out of the board, and sell them the painting. So they were just, plastered all over. She lives in a trailer, and they were up and down the roadway like this. And they got more and more expensive. And the Smithsonian came down and wanted to give her a show. And then the Visionary Museum in Baltimore came down, and they wanted to give her a show. So Ruby will tell you now, I am famous. And before she got really famous, she had a show at the Polk Museum of Art. And I came down for that, and there was all of her work, and she noticed, what do you do in an opening? Well, you drink wine and have cheese, and you have people say good things about you. So she came back and she said, okay, back to her house, and she said, okay, I can have my own opening. I will invite people, but we won't have any wine because there's no drinking. And then we'll invite people to say nice things about me. That's what I do. Come down and say nice things about her. And then she declares that people can buy her work. And she feeds everyone who comes down. It's November 1st. It's the first Saturday in November every year. She just finished her 22nd Ruby opening. And everybody's welcome. And then she feeds you for free one of the best meals you can ever possibly have. Fresh fruit and vegetables, and usually a beet or two. Oops. So this is her walk-in gallery, which is now unfortunately falling down. But she's trying to rebuild it. And this is her at one of her openings. So she reads Bible verses, sometimes she sings, and those people who are going to say good things about her get to sit right behind her, and then she'll call you, and then you'll get to say good things about her. It's a hoot. And then you can buy her works of art. You cannot take her picture unless you buy a work of art. And then she'll stand with you with a work of art. But these are really wonderful. I mean, I must own 30 of her pieces. Some of which she's just given me, because after you say good things about her, she often gives you something. But you've got things like the piano-playing cow here that makes better buttermilk. So these are all characters that she creates in her mind that are just really, really wonderful. Woody Long, unfortunately, has also passed away. He was from the Panhandle area and also had a home in Alabama. Woody. He used to be a house painter, but he also painted ships, and he traveled all around the world. And then he came home, married his wife, with his wife Dot, who was taking a community college course, continuing education with paints, and had paints around the house, and he started picking up her paints and just started creating these incredible, wonderful paintings that talk about the joys he had in his early life. So, like jumping up and down on the bed. He grew up around Plant City with his parents. His father was a drunk, but he loved his father because he took him fishing every once in a while. And all the other people who were picking strawberries and other produce in the Plant City area. And one of the things he really, really liked was that the women, black women, white women, would be together harmoniously. And so this is like a movement kind of thing, because they would sing while they worked in the fields. And so he wanted to produce that kind of rhythmic, wonderful community that they had while they were doing this back-breaking work. Didn't have much of an education. I think he dropped out of school when he was like 7th grade or something, because as a migrant family person, he just couldn't stay in school all the time. Good heart, really, really sweet person. He just had a way with making using color and making rhythm in his paintings that it's just extraordinary. When he got well known, he was invited to go to New York City, where he'd never been, and he saw all of the taxis and just got enamored by these taxis. So he did wonderful paintings of the buildings and the many, many taxis that were everywhere. Mr. B, he likes to be called Mr. B instead of Jack Beaverland. He lives in Antonio, Florida. And he called me one day when I was doing this research and said, okay, I think you ought to come see my work. I think you ought to come over here and see what I have to offer. At that time, he was living in Tampa. And he told me that he had been laid off from a job at a major corporation where he had risen from a very lowly position up into a managerial position and then gotten laid off. They called him Mr. B at his business. But when he got laid off, he wanted to kill somebody. Maybe the person who laid him off, or he wanted to kill himself. But he was raging with anger. And he had a relative who said, I think you ought to paint. And so he started painting and got rid of all the anger. So when I went to see him, he was he was living in a double wide, and I was by myself. And he had told me to come on in, and he was a little bit gruff, and I came in, and what I saw on one side of the wall was a big, huge chest with all kinds of guns. And I thought, oh, well, you know, angry man with guns, not a happy thing. And then I went back to his studio where he was making these very happy paintings, but you can see right behind him was one of his early ones that said stop. So he was trying to control himself. And he told me to pick a painting from the wall, anyone I wanted, and then to come with him. So I picked a painting. He took me to a closet, shut the door, and I thought, oh dear. And then I saw what he was trying to show. These things light up in the dark. It was just terrific. Well, he goes to all kinds of, he does sell his work, he sells it a lot, but he also spends his time in schools with kids who have disabilities. So he talks to them about what to do with anger and what this art has meant in his life. He's also given talks for mental health institutions, and is really a very lovely, wonderful man. Here's one of his, I think it's his daughter. And the thing that happens, what he does is he starts with a saying that he writes down at the bottom and then builds the painting around whatever few words he has there. Very interesting way of working. Macario Jimenez from Naples, Florida. Exceptional artist, just exceptional. He was from the Andes in Peru. And he comes from a long line of people who made these boxes called retablos. They used to be carried into little villages to teach about Christianity. So they were mostly Bible scenes, especially for people who couldn't read and write. And his grandfather and his father were really well known for the excellent retablos that they made. They could look like this, which have the scenes from Peru. He had to escape. He had to leave the Andes because the shining path was killing people. And so he came down to Lima and lived at Lima for a while and eventually was able to come to the United States where his several members of his family are with him. So the boxes open up. The ones that have the doors, and most of them do. And you can see that not only does he do these kinds of scenes about his early life, he also does scenes about the United States. Of course, some of these are huge, whereas the traditional ones were always very small. But you can see here he's got the subway system, he's got the Statue of Liberty, and he's depicting what he saw in New York City. They are made out of a combination of boiled potatoes and plaster, and then painted. So if you go into his workshop, outside of his workshop, he's got this huge container that he boils potatoes in over a fire. And then he's just got all these massive figures that he works one by one, and then he figures where to put them inside the retablos. He is internationally known. You can see his work in museums all over the country. He's done workshops at Harvard. I always think this is kind of ominous because you've got the World Trade Towers there. This was before 9/11 and the plane. You can see a mask shop. Okay, Stanley Papio. As I say, you can see there are a lot of interesting characters in Florida. Stanley Papio was one of them. Now, he came from Canada and worked his way down to Key Largo. And he had a junkyard. This junk, again and again, you see this, people who see possibilities and things that other people toss away. So you can see, he lived in a trailer and he made these creatures. And the neighbors would come over and say, Stanley, you got to clean up your yard. Our property values are going down. This is just an eyesore. It looks horrible. And he would say, nah, man, I'm not going to do that. Not cleaning up anything. And so they would go to the police. The cops would come by and they would give him citations. And he would ignore them. And then eventually they put him in jail. And when he came back out, he started creating characters that mimicked his neighbors. So you don't mess with an artist. They had a strong following in the art community, so most of these have been salvaged and are in the Martello. A lot of them are in the Martello Museum in Key West. James Gibson, how many of you know about the Highwayman? Well, James Gibson, probably the one highwayman who never did anything except paint. I mean, he was able to paint through all of the years, recently died. And here he is when I was interviewing him for the first time in the 90s, dressed to the T's, he always was, and ready to sell work. And, there's sometimes when you regret not buying something. I regret not buying one of these paintings that day. I don't know why I didn't, because they were much more reasonably priced in the 90s than they are today. So the Highwaymen were African American artists centered around Fort Pierce. And they learned from Bean Backus, a white, well-established artist who during Jim Crow days would allow people of any color to come into his studio. So Bean was a great guy. He was also a great drinker. And he loved music, so there was a lot of jazz playing around in his studio. And these black teenage kids would sit in his studio and watch him paint. And Bean would say to him, here's an old piece of Upson board, go paint on this. Here's an old brush, try using a knife. And sometimes he would tell them to go try to paint the same painting that he was painting. So this was a day, when black artists, there really weren't role models for black artists. It wasn't really until the civil rights movement, people started saying, why are there no black artists? Why are there no women artists? They're all white men. And so they knew they couldn't sell their work in a gallery the way Bean Backus did. So they decided what they needed to do was make lots of paintings and sell them cheaply. And so that's what they did. There are even tales about, and they did do this to some degree, where they would set up assembly lines, and somebody would paint the backgrounds, and another person would come by with the same thing of paint and do a tree, and just go on down the line. James Gibson did quite well with his work. You know, of course, there's seminal patchwork, which is still done in the area. Men and women do this. They do traditional designs, but they also change. So whenever you're looking at a traditional artist, understand that their work evolves. It never stays exactly the same. Robert Brogurt, one of my good friends, who was a Mennonite, but he was so conservative that he got kicked out of the Mennonite church. You know how conservative that it must be. So he read the book of Revelations. I met him in the 90s, and he told me that 2000 Armageddon was coming, the rapture would be here. But he painted every scene of, and every verse in Revelations, the book of Revelations. He told me who was going to hell, which was everybody I ever knew, whoever had a drink, whoever got a divorce, who worshipped a God that was not Christian, who was homosexual. He would paint these things. And I would say, Robert, really? And he has changed since. And I see him from time to time, and I ask him, why have you changed? And he said, because I have 4 children, and if I didn't change, you know, I would lose my children. They're all highly educated. He homeschooled most of them. But he's also a person who is really talented with music. So he writes songs and sells them in Nashville. He's been arrested many times for preaching on the street. In Orlando, he was arrested and put in jail. And then a couple months later, he had a show in the City Hall in Orlando. And he says, sometimes, you know, they don't want you around, and other times you're the star. Just go figure. This is a huge piece that I saw in his house. And he was just saying, you know, Bob Dylan's going to hell. All these people, Roy Rogers is going to hell because he carried a gun. Roy Rogers. It was just a little bit much for me. But anyway, you could talk to him and have these great conversations from time to time. And of course, you know, we're the circus state as well. So this is Diamond Jim Parker, who is a clown, and he lived in Gibsonton, which is south of Sarasota, and it's the place where the carny artists and circus people would often come and spend their winters because it was next to the Ringling. And he has these miniature circuses, which were just extreme. They filled a whole trailer. And one of the interesting things about this was that, you know, he says, you know, he's a loner. He didn't have anybody to take care of him. But when he had a heart problem and had to have surgery, it was one of the ladies across the street who brought him into her house. She didn't even know him. But because he was part of the circus, you know, these were the people that you learned to take care of. Extraordinary work. He's not just somebody who made the artwork. He was also a historian. Wayne and Marty Scott, Howie and the Hills they live in, and they made probably all the clown shoes for all the clowns in Barnum and Bailey and in Ringling. Great clown shoes. They just figured everything out. Mario Snchez, Cuban artist, who has passed away, who pretty much documented Key West and Ybor City with the relief carvings that he painted. He was an artist that not only historically depicted everything quite well, but he also knew how to use the rhythm and the movement and the balancing formalism of an artist. His works go for a whole lot. I couldn't afford one. O.L. Samuels, just a few more artists. He also died this year. O.L. says that he was abandoned by his parents by the time he was 8. His mother beat him, and so he ran away, this is what he told me, and lived at a mill where they worked with wood. And when the mill workers would go to lunch, he would try to figure out how to work with the wood himself. So he was on his own early on, He did a lot of tree cutting, no education. This is a man who couldn't tell me the street that he lived on. He could only tell me how to get there visually when I talked to him on the phone. And then I would say, oh, El, go outside and see if you can read the number on the house where you are. And he couldn't do that. Brilliant man, though. Here's one of his pieces. He says that, and another one, you know, he was a boxer. He went to New York City, and he was a boxer, but he was paid by the bookies to lose. And this made him so angry because he felt like he could really win, that he was good enough to really win. But he was paid to lose. He slept on the beach a lot, and when he picked up a piece of wood, he knew what it was saying to him. In other words, for him, and this is true for a lot of carvers, they sense that there is an animal or a character in the wood, and they let it come out. And my last artist, Edward Leedskalnin. Anybody been to Coral Castle in Homestead? Oh, there you go. It's quite the scene, isn't it? Little man who had a sweetheart in Latvia. He called her Sweet 16, and he wanted to build her a castle out of coral. And for those of you who've been there, you know, these chairs, they're comfortable. He's got a bathtub. He's got the moon, the sun. He's got the planets there. And of course, he wrote to Sweet 16 and said, come, marry me. I've built you this castle. She never came. He wrote books about how women should be modest and how they should dress and where they should go and where they shouldn't go. He had all kinds of rules. Oops. So here you can see somebody enjoying the castle. We don't know how he got these huge pieces of coral to the castle. So if you go there, they will tell you all these stories, like he probably or could have had the secrets of how the pyramids were built. He's just a little guy, and he did this all by himself. How on earth could he build and bring that coral to that site for the castle? And no one can answer that question. Okay, that's it. That's a wide range of artists that you've just